There are men who rule nations. And then there are men who shape the destiny of mankind itself. In the ashes of a dying republic, amid whispers of betrayal and the clash of ambition, a young man watched the greatest city on earth devour itself. Rome, once proud, once invincible, had turned its sword inward. The streets that once echoed with triumph now ran red with the blood of Romans killing Romans. The Senate, once a beacon of wisdom, had become a battlefield of egos. And at the heart of it all, the ghost of a fallen general, Julius Caesar, whose death cracked the world in two. It was here, in this chaos, that destiny stared. From the smoke rose a boy, silent, patient, unassuming. He was not the strongest nor the loudest, but he carried within him a vision of Rome reborn, not as a republic fractured by pride, but as an empire united by order. Before an empire could rise, the old world had to fall. Once, Rome had conquered the known world with discipline, law, and unity. But power, like fire, consumes everything it touches. Senators grew rich, generals grew jealous, and the common people, the very soul of Rome, were forgotten. Civil war became the heartbeat of the republic. Marius fought Sulla. Pompey fought Caesar. Brother turned against brother in pursuit of Rome's crown, a crown that did not yet exist. Then came the Ides of March. Steel flashed in the Senate chamber. Julius Caesar, the man who dared to call himself a dictator for life, fell beneath 23 daggers. As his blood touched the marble floors, the republic gasped its last breath. What followed was not freedom, it was fire. Brutus and Cassius fled with the dream of liberty, but their blades had unleashed a storm. Armies rose once more. Legions loyal not to Rome, but to their commanders. The Senate tried to speak, but no one listened. The mob hungered for vengeance, and vengeance came wearing the face of a young heir, Caesar's adopted son. The boy's name was Octavian. Barely 20 years old, sickly, quiet, dismissed by many as too weak to lead. But in his eyes burned something Rome had not seen in years, resolve. He studied the ruins of his uncle's ambition and learned. Where Caesar had charged, Octavian would wait. Where others fought for glory, he would fight for endurance. While Rome burned, he gathered loyalty, forged alliances, and moved like a shadow through the chaos. He watched as enemies revealed themselves. He let time do what swords could not, and slowly the storm began to shift in his favor. The Republic was dying, but in its ashes, the foundations of an empire began to form. For sometimes, history does not end in destruction. It begins there. And from the ruin of liberty, the age of empire was born. When the dust of civil war thickened over Rome, the city seemed cursed to repeat its own mistakes. But destiny, as it often does, had chosen its vessel, not from the legions, not from the Senate, but from the bloodline of a fallen god among men. Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar. A boy thrust into a world of wolves where mercy was weakness and trust was a weapon turned inward. Yet even wolves knew to fear him. When Caesar fell, Rome expected the thunder of another general, a warrior like Pompey or Antony, to seize the throne that did not yet exist. But instead came silence, a quiet young man, thin, pale, and measured, who spoke little and observed everything. He was not born for war, but he learned it. He was not bred for power, but he mastered it. Octavian was Rome's most dangerous weapon, patience wrapped in flesh and flesh. While others roared for vengeance, he whispered for loyalty. While men like Mark Antony marched with swords, Octavian marched with promises. He read the soul of Rome the way a scholar reads an ancient text. Slowly, carefully, knowing that one wrong word could ignite another century of chaos. He forged his first alliance not with blood, but with politics, the second triumvirate alongside Mark Antony and Lepidus. Together they promised to avenge Caesar, but vengeance was only the mask of ambition. Octavian knew what Antony did not. Rome no longer wanted heroes, it wanted peace. And he would become the only man who could give it, by any means necessary. The streets of Rome trembled as lists of enemies were drawn, thousands executed, names carved into marble as warnings. Every rival who whispered against him was silenced, not with cruelty, but with cold precision. Octavian learned to wield propaganda like a sword sharper than steel. Coins bore his image beside Caesar's, a son avenging his divine father. Poets sang of him as the savior of the Republic, even as he quietly strangled what remained of it. He did not chase glory. He built inevitability. When Mark Antony fell in love with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, Octavian saw not romance, but opportunity. He painted Antony as a traitor, a Roman enslaved by a foreign queen, and rallied the people under one banner, Rome for Romans. And when the final war came, it was not fought for honor or vengeance, but for the soul of Rome itself. On the waters of Actium, the gods themselves seemed to hold their breath. As Antony's fleet burned and Cleopatra fled, Octavian did not celebrate. He watched, sighed, knowing, because this was not victory, it was destiny fulfilled. The boy who once hid in the shadows had now become the light. The Republic's last son would become its first emperor. But even as the world bent to his will, he carried a secret wisdom, one his uncle had never learned. Empires are not built with fear alone. They are built with illusion. The illusion of peace, of freedom of choice. Octavian would not destroy the Republic. He would disguise his empire beneath its skin and call it rebirth. By now, Rome had grown tired of chaos, tired of warlords claiming to save her, only to carve her into pieces. The legions were weary, the people broken, the Senate a hollow echo of its former self. And in that exhaustion, Octavian saw his opening. For when men are tired of freedom's noise, they crave the silence of order. Mark Antony had once stood beside Julius Caesar as his most trusted general. Brave, charismatic, adored by the soldiers. He drank deep of glory, spoke louder than wisdom allowed, and believed that Rome was his to inherit. But Octavian was not a man of belief. He was a man of inevitability. The alliance between the two men had been forged in necessity, but it was doomed by nature. Antony, the soldier of passion. Octavian, the master of control. The world was not big enough for both. Antony's heart belonged to Cleopatra, queen of Egypt, a woman whose charm could bend kings to their knees. Together they dreamed of ruling an Eastern empire, a rival to Rome herself. But Octavian understood something Antony did not. In the theater of history, perception is power. He did not need to destroy Antony on the battlefield. Not yet. First, he would destroy him in the minds of men. Through whispers, letters, and carefully placed lies, Octavian crafted the greatest illusion Rome had ever seen. He told the Senate that Antony had betrayed his country, that Cleopatra sought to make Alexandria the new Rome, and that the sacred flame of the Republic was under threat from a foreign queen, and Rome believed him. When the time came, the legions followed Octavian, not because they loved him, but because they feared what would happen if they didn't. The final act began at sea on the glittering blue waters of Actium. There, beneath the burning sun, the fate of two worlds collided. Antony and Cleopatra's grand fleet stood proud, their banners fluttering like the wings of eagles. Octavian's admiral Agrippa cut through them with precision. Ships burned, waves turned to fire, and the cries of men vanished beneath the roar of destiny. When the battle was done, Antony and Cleopatra fled, and in the shadows of their own defeat, they ended their lives. Lovers bound not by victory, but by tragedy. Rome wept no tears, it cheered, for Octavian had promised salvation and he had delivered silence. But victory came at a cost. The last of Rome's great rivals lay dead, and with them the last fragments of the Republic. There were no more enemies left to fight, no more equals to challenge his will. Octavian returned to Rome not as a conqueror, but as a savior. He entered the city unarmed, cloaked in humility, claiming no title but a princeps, the first citizen. The Senate, weary and grateful, bowed to him. They gave him what no Roman had dared to take before, absolute power, wrapped in a silk of respect, and with that, a new dawn rose. The Republic was gone, but its illusion lived on. Rome had a ruler, not a tyrant, not a dictator, an emperor. Octavian would take a new name, Augustus, the exalted one, and from the ashes of endless war, a new order emerged, cold, eternal, unshakable. The boy who had watched Rome fall was now the man who would make her immortal. Rome had seen victory before, but never peace. From its earliest days, the city had been built on conquest, the clash of swords, the march of legions, the roar of the crowd as generals paraded their spoils through the streets. But after a century of civil wars, even Rome's glory had grown weary of blood. When Octavian, now Augustus, stood before the people, he understood something his predecessors never could. That true power does not roar, it whispers. Augustus did not seize power, he allowed it to be given. He returned authority to the Senate, only for them to hand it back with trembling gratitude. He spoke of restoring the Republic, but the Republic he restored existed only in memory. Every decree, every office, every law passed through him like a shadow wearing the mask of democracy. He called himself Princeps, the first among equals, There were no equals left. Still, the illusion mattered, because the Romans, proud of their ancient freedoms, could not accept a king. So Augustus gave them a republic in name, an empire in truth. He understood the psychology of empire. Men could fight against tyranny, but not against comfort. So he gave them peace. He gave them bread, games, and purpose. He rebuilt their temples, their roads, their sense of destiny. The same city that once tore itself apart now became a monument to unity. Under Augustus, marble replaced brick. Chaos gave way to order. Legions once sworn to men now swore to Rome itself, to the eternal vision of its emperor. In the Senate, voices still debated, but their echoes were hollow. Beyond the marble walls, Augustus' laws shaped the lives of millions, from the deserts of Egypt to the forests of Gaul. He reformed the army, the treasury, and the law. He created a postal system, a census, and a network of governors to keep the empire alive. Every piece of Rome moved according to his design, a living machine that could outlast its maker. And yet Augustus was careful. He knew what destroyed Caesar: arrogance. So he cloaked his ambition in humility, his dominance in mercy. He spoke softly, but behind every word stood legions ready to defend his peace. Even the gods seemed to favor him. Temples rose in his honor. Poets sang his name, and statues of his image filled the corners of the empire. The man became myth, a mortal ascending quietly into eternity. Rome had become something new. Not a republic, not a tyranny, but an idea, an empire of order, an empire of law, an empire built not on conquest alone, but on the stability that conquest had brought. Augustus did not just rule the world, he reinvented it. And though time would one day crumble the marble he built, his system, his vision, would echo through kingdoms, dynasties, and nations yet unborn. For he had discovered the greatest truth of all, that empires do not fall from weakness. They fall when they forget who built them. The swords had been sheathed, the legions rested. For the first time in living memory, the thunder of war no longer echoed through the valleys of the empire. Rome, once fractured, bled, and broken, and now stood whole. And at the heart of it all was one man, Augustus. The boy who had risen from the ashes of civil war now ruled an empire that stretched from the misty fields of Britannia to the golden sands of Arabia. But his greatest conquest was time itself. Augustus did not build his empire upon fear alone. He built it upon memory. He understood that power fades when the hand that wields it dies. But legacy becomes immortal. And so he forged something that no sword could cut down. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace. 200 years of order, prosperity, and stability. A golden age in which art, architecture, and law flourished under his shadow. Cities rose like constellations across the empire, their roads running like veins toward the beating heart of Rome. Temples gleamed beneath the Italian sun, forums echoed with poets and philosophers, and marble monuments whispered his name to generations unborn. He rebuilt the world as he wished men to remember it, not as a tyrant's domain, but as a civilization reborn, the center of everything. And through it all, Augustus moved like a quiet god among mortals. He had learned the cruel lesson of Caesar, that power, to endure, must be veiled in reverence. He wore humility as his crown, modesty as his armor. He refused the title of king, yet ruled with a king's hand. Under him, Rome became more than a city. It became an idea of discipline, order, and grandeur that would outlive every emperor, every dynasty, every century. When Augustus finally felt the weight of years upon him, he looked back on his life not as a conqueror, but as a craftsman. He had inherited a world of brick, and he left it in marble. He had taken chaos and turned it into eternity. And as he breathed his last, he asked only one question of those around him: have I played my part well? The curtain of history fell in silence, but the applause of time has never stopped. For from his vision came the foundation of the Western world, the concept of empire, the rhythm of governance, the legacy of peace born from war. Every king, every nation, every dream of dominion that followed, all stood in the shadow of that first emperor. Rome would rise and fall 100 times more. Its monuments would crumble, its legions would fade into dust. But the idea Augustus forged, that from chaos order can be born, would never die. For empires perish, but eternity remembers.